During my chemotherapy recovery, I asked my daughter-in-law not to rearrange my late husband's room. She waited until I slept, burned his things in the backyard, and laughed, "You're next anyway." I fell to my knees as my son whispered, "You should've died instead." The next morning, I left a letter that made her collapse to the floor when she read. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd leave someone with nothing but ashes and regret, but grief does strange things to you, especially when you're already half broken from fighting a disease that's trying to eat you from the inside out. My name is Alana Wutluck. I'm 68 years old, and I've always been too soft for my own good, always the one apologizing even when I was the one bleeding, always believing that if I just loved people hard enough, they'd eventually love me back the same way. Harold used to tell me I had a spine made of silk when I should have had one made of steel, and maybe he was right because I let people walk all over me my whole life, nodding and smiling even when they were wiping their feet on my heart. I was recovering from my third round of chemotherapy in the house Harold and I had built together 40 years ago in a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon, my body so weak some days I couldn't lift a coffee cup without my hands shaking like autumn leaves, my hair gone except for a few stubborn wisps that refused to surrender, my reflection in the mirror showing me a ghost of who I used to be. Harold had died 8 months earlier from a sudden heart attack while I was in the middle of my treatments, just collapsed in the garden while planting tomatoes on a Tuesday morning, and losing him felt like someone had reached into my chest and scooped out everything that mattered, leaving just an empty cavity that echoed with memories. My son Daniel and his wife Lydia had moved into the house to help take care of me, but really I knew it was because they were eager to get their hands on the property, this beautiful 3-bedroom craftsman with the Rearrange porch and the maple trees Harold had planted when Daniel was born, worth easily $700,000 in today's market. I saw the way Lydia looked at the house, calculating and cold, like she was already redecorating in her mind, already imagining which walls she'd knock down and which furniture she'd toss out. "Mom, you really need to let us modernize this place," Lydia said one afternoon while I was resting on the couch, barely strong enough to keep my eyes open. "All this old stuff, it's so depressing." I didn't answer because my stubbornness, my fatal flaw of digging my heels in when I should have been flexible, made me refuse to give her the satisfaction. "We could turn Harold's office into a home gym, don't you think, Daniel? Your mom doesn't need all that space just sitting there collecting dust." I felt my jaw tighten, felt that old familiar anger that I always swallowed down start to bubble up in my throat. "That room stays exactly as it is," I managed to say, my voice hoarse from the medication. "I mean it, Lydia, don't touch anything in there." She smiled at me, that tight little smile that never reached her eyes. "Of course, Alana, whatever you want, it's your house." But I heard the unspoken words hanging in the air like smoke, the "for now" that she didn't need to say out loud. It was a Thursday night when everything shattered into pieces I'd never be able to put back together, when I learned exactly what kind of people I'd been living with, what kind of son I'd raised. I'd gone to bed early around 8 because the exhaustion from the chemo was like carrying a mountain on my shoulders. Every movement required more energy than I had to give, and I'd taken my sleeping pill to escape into unconsciousness where I didn't have to feel the cancer or the grief or the loneliness. I don't know what woke me, maybe some sixth sense that something was terribly wrong, maybe the smell of smoke drifting through my bedroom window that my subconscious recognized as danger. I stumbled out of bed in my nightgown and robe, my legs unsteady, my heart already racing with a dread I couldn't name yet, and made my way through the dark house toward the back door. Through the kitchen window I could see orange flames dancing in the backyard, flickering against the darkness like some hellish celebration, and my stomach dropped because I already knew what was burning, but my mind refused to accept it. I pushed through the back door onto the porch, the cold November air hitting my face, and that's when I saw her standing there in the firelight like some kind of demon, Lydia with a long metal poker in her hand, jabbing at the flames that were consuming everything I had left of Harold. "Stop," I screamed, my voice cracking and desperate. "Stop, that's his jacket." I could see Harold's old fishing jacket, the green canvas one with the torn pocket he'd refused to let me fix because he said it gave it character, curling and blackening in the flames. I stumbled down the porch steps, my legs giving out halfway, and I fell hard on my knees on the cold ground, pain shooting through my joints, but I didn't care because all I could see was Harold's life turning to ash and smoke. "Those are his things, those are his medals from Vietnam, his letters, everything." Lydia turned to look at me, the firelight making her face look cruel and strange, and she laughed, actually laughed like this was funny. "Relax, Alana, you said not to rearrange the room. You didn't say anything about throwing out trash." I crawled forward on my hands and knees like an animal, trying to reach the fire, trying to save something, anything, but the heat pushed me back. "Please," I buggered, tears streaming down my face. "Please stop, those are my memories, that's all I have left of him." She poked at a box with the poker and more papers caught fire, Harold's handwriting disappearing into flames. You need to let go of the past anyway, she said, her voice light and casual like we were discussing the weather. All this clutter, it's not healthy. Besides, and here she looked at me with those cold eyes that held no warmth, no humanity, you're next anyway, so what does it matter? The words hit me like a physical blow, knocked the air right out of my lungs. What did you say? I whispered, still on my knees in the grass. You heard me, Lydia said, turning back to the fire. Cancer's going to finish what it started. Why keep all this junk around when you won't be here to see it? I heard footsteps behind me and turned, hope flirting stupidly in my chest that maybe Daniel would help, maybe my son would defend me, maybe I'd raised him better than this. But Daniel just stood there in the shadows near the house, his arms crossed over his chest, his face hard and expressionless. Daniel, I said, reaching out one hand toward him like I was drowning and he was the shore. Tell her to stop, please, those are your father's things. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, something that made me feel colder than the November night ever could. You should have died instead of Dad, he said quietly, the words precise and deliberate like he'd been thinking them for a while, and was relieved to finally say them out loud. Then he turned and walked back into the house, leaving me there on the ground with his words echoing in my head and Harold's memories burning in front of me. I don't remember how long I knelt there watching everything disappear into smoke and ash, watching Lydia feed the flames until there was nothing left but glowing embers and the bitter smell of burned fabric and paper hanging in the air. At some point she went inside, satisfied with her destruction, leaving me alone in the dark with the dying fire. My knees were numb, my face wet with tears I didn't remember crying, my whole body shaking from cold and shock, and a grief so profound it felt like drowning in an ocean with no shore in sight. But something else was growing inside me too, something hard and sharp that I'd never felt before, a clarity that cut through all my softness and people-pleasing and desperate need to be loved. I realized in that moment, kneeling in the ruins of my husband's memory, that I had been living among strangers, that the family I'd devoted my life to building had been an illusion, a pretty picture I'd painted over an ugly truth. My son wished I was dead. My daughter-in-law was waiting for me to die, and I'd been so busy being gentle and understanding and accommodating that I'd let them treat me like I was already in the ground. That night something in me died, the part that kept apologizing and forgiving and hoping things would get better, and in its place something else was born, something that knew exactly what needed to be done. I pulled myself up slowly, every joint screaming in protest, and walked back into the house on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Lydia was in the kitchen making herself tea like she hadn't just destroyed irreplaceable pieces of my life, humming some tune I didn't recognize. There's chamomile if you want some, she said without looking at me. Might help you sleep. I didn't answer, just walked past her to Harold's office, the room she'd been so eager to turn into a gym, the room where all his important things had been stored. I opened the closet door and stared at the empty shelves, the empty hangers, and I felt my stubbornness, that old floor of mine, harden into something like steel. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd erased Harold, and soon she'd erase me too, and then this house would be hers and Daniel's to do with as they pleased. But what Lydia didn't know, what she couldn't have known because she was too busy calculating her inheritance to pay attention to details, was that the things she burned tonight weren't the things that mattered. 3 weeks ago, when I'd had a good day and some energy to spare, I'd packed up all of Harold's actual important documents, his real medals, his letters to me, the photographs I treasured, and taken them to my friend Margaret's house for safekeeping. What I'd left in the closet were duplicates, copies, things that looked important but weren't, a trap I'd set without even fully realizing I was setting one. Because deep down I'd known that Lydia couldn't be trusted, that she was counting down the days until I died and she could finally have what she wanted. And she'd just walked right into the only thing that could save her and set it on fire. I spent that night sitting at the dining room table with my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold a pen, my pride wounded because I'd been such a fool, my temper simmering underneath my skin because how dare my own son wish me dead. I pulled out the folder I'd hidden in my bedroom, the one containing the updated will Harold and I had signed 6 months before he died, before we knew I'd get sick, before we knew he'd be gone so soon. Harold had been insistent about updating it, said he didn't trust the way Lydia looked at our house, didn't like how Daniel had changed since marrying her, become harder and greedier. I want to make sure you're protected, he'd said, holding my hand across the lawyer's desk. I want to make sure if anything happens to me, you're taken care of, and if anything happens to you, everything goes where it should. We'd added a clause that seemed simple enough at the time, a conditional inheritance that stated Daniel would receive the house and the savings, and everything only if he properly cared for me during any illness I might face. And if he failed to do so, if he neglected me or abandoned me or treated me poorly, everything would transfer instead to the Whitlock Cancer Foundation that Harold and I had been supporting for years. There were required witnesses to any mistreatment, required documentation, required proof that Daniel had failed in his duties as a son. At the time I thought we were being paranoid, thought we'd never need that clause, thought surely my son loved me enough to take care of me. But Harold knew better. Harold always knew better. I started writing the letter around 2 in the morning, my hands still trembling but my mind crystal clear, clearer than it had been in months. Dear Lydia, I wrote, and then I laid it all out, every detail of the will she didn't know existed, every condition Daniel had failed to meet, every witness who'd seen what happened tonight. Our neighbors, the Johnsons, had been out walking their dog when Lydia started the fire, had seen the whole thing through their fence, had already texted me asking if I was okay and if I needed them to call someone. Mrs. Alvarez across the street had heard the shouting and come to her window, had watched the entire scene unfold, had the timeline documented because she was the kind of woman who wrote everything down in her daily journal. I had witnesses. I had documentation. I had the video from the security camera Harold had installed last year pointed at the backyard that Lydia didn't know about because I'd never mentioned it, my impulsiveness keeping secrets without planning to, and that camera had captured everything, every flame, every cruel word, every moment of her destroying property that wasn't hers to destroy. I wrote it all in the letter, explaining exactly what was going to happen, how I'd already contacted our lawyer Mr. Calder that evening through email time-stamped before midnight, how the wheels were already in motion, how by the time she read this letter, everything she'd been waiting for would be gone. The hardest part was packing my bag, choosing what to take with me, my stubbornness making me want to take everything or nothing at all, but my practical side knowing I needed to be smart. I packed my medications, some clothes, the photo of Harold I kept by my bedside, my laptop with all the documentation I'd need, the folder with the will and the lawyer's contact information. I called Margaret at 5 in the morning, knowing she'd be awake because she was always an early riser, and asked if I could stay with her for a while. Of course, honey, she said, her voice full of concern. I'll come get you right now. No, I said, I'll take an Uber. I don't want anyone here to know where I'm going. I left the letter on the kitchen counter where Lydia would find it when she came down for her morning coffee, propped against the fruit bowl where it couldn't be missed. Then I slipped out the front door with my small suitcase, just as the sun was starting to turn the sky grey and pink, and I didn't look back at the house I'd loved for 40 years, because I knew if I did I might lose my nerve. Margaret lived in a retirement community 20 minutes away, a small apartment that felt safe and quiet and far away from the nightmare my life had become. She didn't ask many questions, just made me tea and toast and let me sleep in her guest room until I was ready to talk. When I finally told her everything, she held my hand and said, "You're doing the right thing, Alina. You're finally standing up for yourself." But I wasn't sure if it was the right thing or just the only thing left. Wasn't sure if I was being strong or just being vindictive. Wasn't sure if Harold would be proud of me or disappointed that I was destroying our son's future. My flaws were screaming at me, my pride saying I should have handled this differently, my stubbornness saying I should have fought harder to make them love me, my people-pleasing nature saying maybe I should call it all off and just forgive them and go back. But then I remembered Lydia's laugh, remembered Daniel's words, "You should have died instead of Dad," and I knew there was no going back from that, no amount of forgiveness that could erase what they'd shown me about who they really were. Mr. Calder called me around 9 that morning. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, his voice professional but kind, "I received your email and reviewed the documentation you sent. The security footage is quite clear. I've also been in contact with your neighbors who are willing to provide sworn statements. Based on the terms of the will and the evidence of neglect and emotional abuse, I'm prepared to begin the transfer process immediately." "How long will it take?" I asked, my voice small and tired. "Given that the conditions are clearly documented and witnessed, we can have the preliminary paperwork filed by end of business today. The actual transfer will take about a week to finalize, but I can have movers there this afternoon to begin securing the property and documenting everything for the estate." "This afternoon," I repeated, something like panic fluttering in my chest. "That's very fast." "Mrs. Whitlock," Mr. Calder said gently, "the will is airtight. Your husband made sure of that. And frankly, after seeing that video, I think the sooner we act, the better. They've already destroyed property that belonged to the estate. We need to prevent any further damage." I thought about Lydia burning Harold's things, about Daniel standing there letting it happen, about how they'd probably celebrate tonight thinking I was too weak to fight back. "Okay," I said, "do it." I spent the rest of the morning at Margaret's trying not to think about what was happening, trying not to imagine Lydia's face when she read the letter, trying not to feel guilty about the bomb I'd dropped on my own son's life. But my guilt kept circling back to what he'd said to me, those words that had cut deeper than any cancer ever could, and I reminded myself that I didn't create this situation. I just refused to be its victim. Around noon, Margaret made me lunch that I couldn't eat because my stomach was twisted in knots, and we sat together watching old movies on her television. Not really watching, but just existing in the same space while my whole world rearranged itself miles away. My phone rang around 2:30. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway, my heart pounding. "Mom," Daniel's voice came through tight and strange. Mom, what the hell is going on? Don't call me that, I said quietly, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. You lost the right to call me that last night. There are movers here, he said, panic creeping into his tone. And some lawyer saying we have to leave, saying the house doesn't belong to me. What did you do? I didn't do anything, Daniel. You did this. What are you talking about? Where are you? Somewhere safe. Somewhere I should have gone months ago. Mom, please, we can talk about this. We can work it out. I laughed, and it sounded bitter even to my own ears. Like we worked it out last night, when your wife burned your father's belongings and you told me I should have died instead of him. Silence on the other end. Then I didn't mean that. Yes, you did, and that's okay. I understand now. Understand what? That you're not the son I raised, that you haven't been that person for a long time. Maybe you never were and I just refused to see it. This is because of Lydia, isn't it? She found that letter you left and she's been freaking out, saying you're trying to steal our inheritance. It's not your inheritance, Daniel. It never was. Your father and I made sure of that. What the hell does that mean? It means we updated our will before he died. It means everything was conditional on you taking proper care of me. It means you failed. The house, the money, all of it goes to charity now. You get nothing. I could hear him breathing hard, could hear Lydia screaming something in the background. You can't do this, he said, his voice breaking. You can't just take everything away. I'm your son. And I was your mother. I was dying and you told me I should have died faster. What did you think was going to happen? He was quiet for a long moment. Then where are you staying? That's none of your business anymore. Mom, please, don't call me again, Daniel. I hung up before he could respond, before I could hear whatever manipulation or guilt trip or desperate plea he was preparing, and I turned off my phone because I couldn't trust myself not to answer if he called back. Couldn't trust my old instincts to smooth things over and make everyone happy even at my own expense. Margaret squeezed my shoulder. You okay? She asked. No, I said honestly, but I will be. Mr. Calder called Margaret's landline an hour later with an update. The movers are documenting everything and preparing to secure the property. Your son and daughter-in-law are refusing to leave voluntarily, so I've contacted the police to assist with the eviction since the property is legally transferring ownership. It should all be resolved by this evening. Eviction, I repeated, the word feeling heavy and final. Yes, I'm sorry this is difficult, but given their behavior and the destruction of estate property, we can't risk further damage. The foundation is already prepared to take possession. What about their things, their clothes and personal items? They'll have supervised access to collect their belongings within the next 48 hours. But the house itself, all the furniture, all the original contents, that all belongs to the estate now. I thought about them scrambling to pack their lives, thought about Lydia's face when the police showed up, thought about Daniel realizing his mother had actually followed through. And I felt something I didn't expect to feel. Relief. Pure, clean relief that I'd finally done something for myself, finally stopped being walked on, finally used that steel spine Harold always said I had buried somewhere deep inside. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls and meetings with Mr. Calder to finalize everything. The foundation sent someone to inspect the house and take inventory, discovered that beyond Harold's things there wasn't much damage, that Lydia and Daniel had mostly just been living there without contributing to maintenance or utilities, treating it like a free hotel while they waited for me to die. The neighbors gave their statements, detailed and damning, describing the shouting and the fire and the cruelty they'd witnessed. Mrs. Alvarez told Mr. Calder that she'd heard Lydia make comments before about me being in the way, and how she couldn't wait for the old lady to finally go. And suddenly I realized that night in the backyard wasn't an isolated incident, it was just the first time they'd stopped pretending. The security footage was turned over to the police as evidence of property destruction, and while the district attorney decided not to file criminal charges given the family circumstances, it was enough to make the civil case for the estate transfer absolutely bulletproof. By Friday afternoon, less than a week after I'd knelt in the grass watching my husband's memories burn, the house was officially property of the Whitlock Cancer Foundation, and Daniel and Lydia were officially homeless. Margaret showed me the local news article online about the donation. Retired teacher leaves $700,000 estate to cancer research, the headline read, and there was a quote from the foundation's director talking about how the donation would fund treatment for patients who couldn't afford it, how it would help families like mine who'd been devastated by this disease. Harold would have loved that, I thought. He would have loved knowing our house was going to help people who were suffering, that it wasn't just going to become another renovation project for people who didn't appreciate what it meant. The article mentioned me by name but not Daniel, didn't explain why I'd chosen to give everything away instead of leaving it to my son, and I was grateful for that small mercy. He was still my son, even if he'd forgotten I was his mother, and I didn't want to publicly shame him even though part of me thought he deserved it. That was my people-pleasing showing again. I knew, my stubborn inability to completely let go of the hope that maybe someday he'd understand, maybe someday he'd apologize, maybe someday we'd find some way back to each other. But I also knew that hope was probably foolish, that some things once broken stay broken, that some words once said can never be unsaid. 2 weeks after everything fell apart, I went to see the house one last time. Mr. Calder had arranged it, said I could have an hour there alone before the foundation started making changes, before it stopped being mine and Harold's and became something else. I stood on the front porch where we'd drunk coffee together on summer mornings, where we'd watched Daniel learn to ride his bike, where we'd carved our initials in the wood railing on our anniversary 35 years ago. The maple trees Harold planted were bare now, skeletal against the grey December sky, but they were still there, still standing, still marking the passage of time like they always had. Inside, the house felt empty but not sad, felt like it was waiting for its next chapter, ready to transform into something that would help people instead of harboring resentment and cruelty. I walked through each room slowly, touching walls that held memories, standing in doorways where I'd lived 1,000 ordinary moments that had meant everything. Harold's office was empty now, truly empty, the shelves bare and the desk gone, and I stood there for a long time thinking about the man who'd loved me enough to protect me even after he was gone, who'd known I'd need that protection because he'd seen things in our son that I'd refused to see. The backyard looked the same except the fire pit had been cleaned out, the ashes removed, no trace remaining of what had happened there. I stood on the porch looking at the spot where I'd knelt and cried and felt my whole world end, and I realized that night had been an ending but also a beginning, had destroyed one version of my life but made space for something else to grow. I still had cancer. I was still weak and tired and scared of dying. I was still grieving Harold every single day. But I wasn't letting people destroy me anymore. I wasn't apologizing for taking up space. I wasn't pretending to be smaller and weaker and less important than I was just to make other people comfortable. That was something. That was worth the cost of everything else. I left a note for the foundation director on the kitchen counter, told him about Harold's garden in the back where he'd planted vegetables every spring, asked if they might consider maintaining it as part of the property, maybe letting patients use it as a therapeutic space. Then I locked the door behind me and walked to my Uber without looking back, because this time I didn't need to look back. This time I was moving forward into whatever came next. Daniel tried to contact me 3 more times over the following month, left voicemails I didn't listen to, sent emails I deleted without reading, even showed up at Margaret's building once, but the security wouldn't let him up without my permission. Lydia tried once too, sent a long text message that started with "I'm sorry" and ended with "we deserve another chance," and I blocked her number without responding because some people don't deserve chances. Some people show you exactly who they are and you need to believe them. My lawyer sent a formal cease and desist letter after the incident at Margaret's, made it clear that any further contact would be considered harassment, and after that they finally stopped. I heard through mutual friends that they'd moved to an apartment across town, that Daniel was working more hours to make rent, that Lydia was angry at everyone but especially at me, that they were telling people I'd gone crazy from the chemo and stolen their inheritance. Let them tell whatever story they needed to tell, I thought. I knew the truth. The people who mattered knew the truth. And most importantly, Harold would have known the truth. My cancer went into remission in January, 3 months after the fire, and my oncologist said it was nothing short of miraculous given how advanced it had been, how aggressive the treatments had needed to be. I didn't feel miraculous. I felt tired and old and damaged in ways that had nothing to do with disease, but I was alive. I was staying with Margaret in her guest room that had become my room, decorated now with my things, my photos, my life condensed into a smaller space, but a space that was mine and safe and free from people who wished I was dead. I started volunteering at the cancer center where I'd received treatment, talking to newly diagnosed patients who were scared and alone, telling them about resources and support groups, holding their hands when they cried because I remembered what it felt like to be that terrified. The foundation that now owned Harold's house invited me to their annual fundraising gala, sat me at the head table, made a speech about the generous donation that would help so many people. I cried during the speech, but they were different tears than the ones I'd cried in the backyard, tears that came from something being created instead of destroyed. On what would have been Harold's 71st birthday, I drove to his grave and sat there for hours telling him everything that had happened, everything I'd done, everything I'd lost and everything I'd kept. I don't know if I did the right thing, I said to the headstone that bore his name and dates and the word beloved carved into granite. I don't know if you'd be proud of me or disappointed. I don't know if I was strong or just cruel. But I couldn't let them keep destroying you, keep destroying us, keep treating your memory like garbage to be burned away. I couldn't keep being the person who just takes it and smiles and says it's okay when it's not okay. I miss you so much it still feels like drowning most days, but I'm not drowning, I'm swimming, I'm still here. And I'm going to keep being here for as long as I can, and I'm going to do it on my own terms now, without apologizing, without making myself smaller, without letting people who don't love me pretend they do. The wind picked up and scattered leaves across his grave, and I chose to believe that was Harold answering, telling me he understood, telling me I'd done what needed to be done. 6 months after that night in the backyard, the foundation turned Harold's house into a respite care center for cancer patients and their families, a place where people could stay during treatment instead of having to commute long distances or pay for hotels they couldn't afford. They kept Harold's garden, expanded it actually, added benches where patients could sit in the sun, planted flowers that would bloom in rotation throughout the year. They put a small plaque by the front door that read, "The Harold Whitlock House," and included his dates and the words, "In memory of a man who believed in taking care of people." They invited me to the opening ceremony, asked if I wanted to say a few words, and I stood on that porch where I drank coffee and watched my life unfold, and told the crowd of supporters and patients and volunteers about Harold, about his kindness, about his garden, about how he'd always believed in leaving the world better than he found it. I didn't mention Daniel. I didn't mention Lydia. I didn't mention the fire or the betrayal or the revenge. I just talked about love and loss and transformation, about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us create space for the best things to grow. And I meant it. Standing there on that porch looking at all those people who would be helped by the place Harold and I had built together, I meant every word. My son never apologized, never admitted he was wrong, never acknowledged that telling your dying mother she should have died instead of your father might be something worth saying sorry for. Maybe he thought he was the victim in this story, thought his unreasonable mother had stolen his inheritance out of spite, thought I'd gone crazy and destroyed his life for no reason. Or maybe, and this was harder to accept, maybe he just didn't care. Maybe I'd always been an obligation to him instead of a person. Maybe he'd been counting down the days until I died long before the cancer came. I'd never know for sure. I'd decided I didn't need to know. All I needed to know was that I'd finally learned to protect myself, learned to use that steel spine Harold always said I had, learned that being soft didn't mean being weak, but it also didn't mean being everyone's doormat. My flaws were still there, my stubbornness, my pride, my impulsiveness, my tendency to dig my heels in and make things harder than they needed to be. But those flaws had also saved me. My stubbornness had made me refuse to let them win. My pride had made me fight back instead of accepting defeat. My impulsiveness had made me act before I could talk myself out of it. Maybe flaws weren't always flaws. Maybe sometimes they were survival skills wearing uncomfortable clothes. I still live with Margaret in her retirement community. My health is stable, my cancer quiet for now, though we both know it could come back anytime. That remission is just a pause, not a cure. I spend my days volunteering and reading and learning to enjoy my own company, learning to be okay with silence and solitude and the space I take up in the world. I've made friends here, people who know my story and don't judge me for it, who understand that family isn't always the people you're born to, but sometimes the people you choose. Margaret jokes that we're like the Golden Girls but older and with worse health insurance, and she's not wrong. We watch our shows and cook our meals and complain about our aches and pains, and support each other through the hard days when grief or fear or regret threatens to swallow us whole. It's not the life I imagined when Harold and I built that house 40 years ago. It's not the life I wanted when I watched my husband plant tomatoes in the garden and thought we'd grow old together there. But it's my life, mine, and nobody gets to take it from me or burn it down or tell me I should have died instead. That's worth more than any inheritance, more than any house, more than any relationship that was built on the expectation that I'd eventually stop existing so other people could have what they wanted. I survived the cancer and I survived the betrayal and I survived my own heartbreak, and I did it by finally choosing myself over people who never chose me. And if that makes me cruel or vindictive or a bad mother, then so be it. I can live with that. I am living with that. And every morning I wake up in this small guest room that's become my home. I think about Lydia reading that letter, about her face when she realized what she'd lost, about Daniel being told to leave the house he thought was his, and I feel something that's not quite satisfaction but close to it, something that feels like justice served cold and final and exactly on time.